I pulled into the driveway, dirt crunching under the tires of my old truck. The sun was setting behind the hills, casting long shadows over the fields, but I could see it, Janice's car, parked in front of the house. My heart skipped a beat. She wasn't supposed to be home. It was Tuesday, and she always worked late at the office. Something didn't feel right. I sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel, trying to shake the feeling gnawing at my gut. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe she wasn't feeling well. But deep down, I knew this wasn't just one of those things. In recent months, Janice had been different, distant, irritable, like she couldn't stand being around me. The woman who once smiled at my dirty boots and work-worn hands now looked at me like I was just part of the furniture. And I couldn't ignore the new clothes she'd been buying, the perfume I never smelled on her. I stepped out of the truck, the cool evening air doing little to calm me down. As I walked toward the front door, my mind raced. I'd never had a reason to doubt her before. We'd been married for nearly 15 years, built a life out here in the country. I worked hard every day to give her and the kids everything they needed. But lately, it seemed like what I had to offer wasn't enough for her. The front door creaked as I pushed it open. Inside, the house was quiet. Too quiet. I stood in the entryway, listening for any sound, the clink of dishes, the shuffle of feet, but there was nothing. My boots echoed against the floor as I stepped into the living room. Her bag was on the couch, her phone next to it. I glanced at the screen. It was lit up with a message. Without thinking, I reached for the phone. My hands were trembling as I read the text. It was from someone named Ken, a name I hadn't heard before. Can't wait to see you tomorrow. Missing you already. My blood ran cold. The world around me seemed to spin, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. There it was. Proof of what I had feared but hadn't dared to believe. Janice was cheating on me. I stood frozen, my mind reeling. How long had this been going on? How many times had she lied to me, telling me she was at work while she was with him? My hands clenched into fists, rage building inside me. I wanted to break something, to scream, but instead, I swallowed it all down. I wouldn't let her see me like this. Not yet. I set the phone back down on the couch, my movements deliberate, controlled. This wasn't the time to confront her. Not until I knew exactly what I was dealing with. But one thing was clear. Janice and this Ken guy were going to pay for what they'd done to me. Over the next few days, I kept my distance, watching her every move, piecing together the lies. I noticed the little things I hadn't paid attention to before, the way she lingered on her phone, the fake smiles, the empty small talk. We'd been drifting apart for months, but now it was painfully obvious. She wasn't mine anymore. Her heart belonged to someone else, someone I didn't even know. It killed me to act normal around her, to pretend I hadn't seen the message, but I needed time. I needed to know who this Ken Bimp was and what kind of man would dare step into my life, into my marriage. I didn't ask her questions, didn't push her. Instead, I quietly did my research. Turned out, Ken worked at the same place as Janice, a fancy real estate office in town. He was everything I wasn't, smooth, well-dressed, city boy. The kind of man Janice had started to admire. I thought about confronting her then, ending it all with one explosive conversation, but that wasn't my style. I wasn't a man of words, and I wasn't going to let them off easy. No, I wanted them to feel the pain I was feeling. I wanted them to suffer. The plan came to me slowly, in bits and pieces. It started as just a passing thought, but the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. I had friends in the auto repair business, guys who owed me favors. Guys who knew how to sabotage a car without leaving a trace. Ken was going to pay for what he'd done, but not in the way he expected. I was going to take from him the way he'd taken from me, piece by piece, until there was nothing left. I watched Janice leave the house one morning, heading off to work like everything was fine. As soon as she was gone, I called up one of my old buddies, a mechanic I'd known since high school. He owed me a favor for some livestock I'd sold him at a discount last year. I told him what I needed, and he didn't ask questions. We agreed on a plan. In a few days, Ken's car would break down, and not just break down, it would be beyond repair. It was a small start, but it felt like justice. As I hung up the phone, a cold satisfaction washed over me. This wasn't the end, it was only the beginning. The days that followed felt like a slow burn, an ember of rage growing inside me with every passing moment. I kept playing my part, the hard-working husband, the unsuspecting fool, while Janice continued with her lies. I'd catch her in the kitchen, typing quickly on her phone, the glow of the screen casting shadows across her face. She'd look up at me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, and I'd smile back, holding in the storm building inside. Every night, she'd sit across from me at the dinner table, pretending everything was fine. She didn't know I could see through her now, didn't realize I'd found out her secret. The woman I had married was gone, replaced by someone I didn't recognize. And all the while, I kept thinking about that name, Ken Bimp. Just the thought of him made my blood boil. He wasn't just stealing my wife, he was stealing my life. Every second she spent with him was a second stolen from me, from our family. The plan I had set in motion with the car gave me a sense of control, but it wasn't enough. I wanted to see him suffer, to watch him unravel the way I had when I first found out. My mind wandered into dark places I'd never thought it would go. At work, out in the fields, I imagined all the ways I could make him pay. But I knew I had to be careful. If I acted too soon, I'd lose the chance to expose them both. So I waited. One evening, I decided to follow Janice. She had been acting more secretive than usual, leaving for work early, coming home late. When she kissed the kids goodbye and stepped out the door, I grabbed my keys and slipped out the back. I kept a good distance as I trailed her car down the highway, my hands gripping the steering wheel tighter with every mile. She wasn't heading to her office, I knew that much. Instead, she drove to a small coffee shop on the outskirts of town. My heart pounded in my chest as I watched her pull into the parking lot. I parked a few spaces down and watched as she got out of the car, her eyes scanning the lot like she was looking for someone. And then I saw him, Ken Bimp. Tall, slick, wearing one of those tailored suits that looked like it cost more than my truck. He walked right up to her, gave her a smile, and she smiled back. The kind of smile I hadn't seen in years. They walked inside together, like they'd done it 100 times before. I sat there, staring at the empty space where they had just stood, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. It was one thing to know she was cheating. It was another to see it with my own eyes. All I could think about was how badly I wanted to confront them, but I wasn't ready yet. This was just the beginning. A few days later, the time had come. My mechanic friend had finished the job, and Ken's car was set to fail at any moment. I'd been waiting for the call, checking my phone every few minutes as I worked in the barn. When it finally rang, I felt a sick sort of satisfaction settle in my chest. "Bill, it's done. His car's toast," my friend said on the other end. "Good. Appreciate it," I replied, keeping my voice steady, though inside, I was ready to explode. The first part of my plan was complete, but I wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. The next day, as I was heading into town for supplies, I saw it, Ken's car. Stalled out on the side of the highway. He was standing there, looking frustrated, talking to someone on his phone. I slowed down as I passed, just to get a good look at him. There he was, Mr. Slick, the man who thought he could walk into my life and take what was mine. I smiled to myself, imagining the anger and confusion he must have felt when his precious car gave out on him. But that wasn't enough. Watching his inconvenience, his frustration, it didn't ease the ache inside me. I needed more. I needed him to feel the loss I was feeling. As I drove past, I thought about what else I could do, how I could tighten the noose. At home that evening, Janice didn't mention a thing about Ken's car troubles. Of course, she wouldn't. As far as she knew, everything was still going according to her plan. I sat across from her at dinner, forcing myself to act normal, to keep the charade going. The kids were chattering about their day, oblivious to the tension between us, and Janice sat there with her fake smiles. Acting like the perfect wife. But I could see it now, the cracks. She was starting to feel the strain. Ken wasn't so perfect anymore, not without his fancy car to drive her around. I knew their little fantasy world was beginning to fall apart, and it was only a matter of time before the rest of it came crashing down. After dinner, I stepped outside, needing some air. The cool night breeze washed over me as I leaned against the porch railing, staring out at the darkened fields. I thought about what I'd seen at the coffee shop. The way Janice had looked at Ken. It wasn't love, it was lust, excitement. She wasn't in love with him. She was in love with the idea of something new, something shiny and different. But soon enough, she'd realize what she was losing. And by then, it would be too late. As I stood there, I made a decision. The car was just the first strike. There was more to come, and when I was done, Ken wouldn't just lose a car. He'd lose everything he had, just like I had. Days turned into weeks, and the tension at home grew unbearable. Janice was growing more distant, and I couldn't help but notice the way she was starting to crumble under the weight of her own lies. The small cracks I'd seen before were widening, and soon, the entire facade would collapse. But I wasn't ready for that yet. I had more to set in motion, and she had no idea what was coming. Ken's car incident had slowed him down, but it wasn't enough to sever their connection. I could still feel her slipping away. And as much as it made me sick, I had to play the part of the clueless husband for a while longer. It was the only way to see this through. Every morning, I'd wake up, put on a smile, and go about my day as if nothing was wrong. But inside, I was watching them, Janice and Ken, planning my next move. I decided to take things up a notch. I wanted them both to feel the walls closing in. The next time I saw Ken's car outside Janice's office, I knew what I had to do. I had a connection with a local tow company. A buddy from high school who owed me a favor, much like my mechanic friend. With one phone call, I arranged for Ken's car to be towed, making sure it would be out of commission for at least a few days. It was easy. All I had to do was make it look like an innocent mistake, a mix-up with parking restrictions. The satisfaction I felt when I saw Ken's car being hauled away was indescribable. I knew it wouldn't ruin him, not yet, but it was another inconvenience, another chink in his shiny armor. It was a small victory, but it was enough to keep me going. Watching from a distance as he stood there on the curb, talking frantically on his phone, I realized how fragile his world really was. He wasn't used to things going wrong. Meanwhile, at home, Janice started to notice something was off. She became more jumpy, more paranoid. I could see her mind working, trying to make sense of the little things she hadn't expected. Ken's car troubles, his frustration, her own growing fear of being caught. It was all starting to unravel, and it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down around them. But still, I wasn't ready for that confrontation. Not yet. Instead, I turned my focus to the next part of my plan, exposing their affair publicly. If Janice thought she could hide this from me, she was wrong. I was going to show her just how deeply I knew her secrets, and I was going to make sure the whole town knew as well. But I needed the right moment, the perfect opportunity to pull the rug out from under them both. And I had just the idea in mind. The annual wine festival was coming up, a huge event that everyone in town attended. It was a big deal, especially for Janice. She loved the festival, the glamour, the people, the attention. It was her chance to step out of our quiet, rural life and into something more exciting, something that made her feel like she was part of a different world. And this year, I knew Ken would be there, too. It was the perfect opportunity to set my plan into motion. I spent the next few days preparing, gathering information, making sure everything would go exactly as I wanted. I had friends in town who owed me favors, people who worked at the festival. With a few well-placed conversations, I made sure the stage was set for a grand reveal. The day of the festival arrived, and I played my part flawlessly. I acted like everything was normal, like I was excited to attend, just as I had been in years past. Janice seemed relieved by my attitude, probably thinking I was none the wiser. She dressed up, wore that expensive perfume she'd been saving for special occasions, and we drove into town together. But while she was putting on her mask, I was already thinking about how this would end. The festival was packed, people from all over the county milling about, sipping wine and enjoying the atmosphere. Janice stayed close to me at first, probably out of habit, but I could see her eyes scanning the crowd, looking for him. I didn't say anything. I just waited, biding my time. Eventually, she excused herself, saying she was going to meet some friends. I nodded, pretending not to notice the excitement in her voice. I knew exactly where she was going. I followed her at a distance, keeping to the shadows of the tents and booths. She made her way to the far end of the festival grounds, where the vendors were set up. And there he was, Ken, dressed in a crisp shirt, looking every bit the part of the suave city man. Janice went to him like a moth to a flame, her face lighting up in a way it hadn't for me in years. They exchanged a few words before slipping away behind one of the wine stalls, thinking they were hidden from view. But they weren't. I had made sure of that. A few minutes later, I made my move. I approached the main stage, where the festival's organizers were gathered. With a quiet word to one of the men I knew, I got access to the microphone. My heart was pounding, but I kept my voice steady, calm, as I prepared to make the announcement that would change everything. "Ladies and gentlemen," I began, my voice echoing through the speakers. The crowd fell silent, turning to look at the stage. I just want to take a moment to acknowledge two very special people who are here with us today. My wife, Janice, and her dear friend, Ken. The words hung in the air, thick with tension. I could see the confusion on people's faces, the way they turned to look around, trying to spot the couple I had just named. And then, slowly, eyes began to widen as they realized what was happening. Janice, I said, my voice steady, but cold, why don't you and Ken come on up here? Don't be shy. Everyone deserves to see how close you two have gotten. The crowd was buzzing now, whispers spreading like wildfire. I could see Janice and Ken in the distance, frozen in place, their faces pale. They hadn't expected this. They hadn't expected me to know. But now, there was no escaping it. They were exposed. And this was only the beginning. The silence that followed my announcement was suffocating. For a few agonizing seconds, no one moved. The air around me seemed to freeze as the weight of my words settled over the crowd. Janice and Ken stood there, their faces drained of color, their bodies rigid as if the ground had just opened up beneath them. I watched Janice closely, hoping to catch a flicker of guilt or remorse in her eyes. But instead, I saw something else, shock, yes, but also anger. She wasn't sorry for what she had done, she was furious that I had exposed her. The crowd around us started murmuring, heads turning to each other, sharing wide-eyed glances. People who had known us for years were whispering behind their hands, trying to make sense of what they'd just heard. I couldn't help but feel a twisted sense of satisfaction. This was what I had been waiting for. All those nights spent biting my tongue, watching her sneak around behind my back, it had led to this moment. Now, she couldn't hide anymore. The truth was out in the open for everyone to see. Ken tried to make a move first, stepping forward as if he could somehow control the situation. He raised a hand, almost like he was trying to calm the crowd, but it was too late for that. "Bill, this isn't the place," he said, his voice low but desperate, like he was trying to reason with me. I met his eyes with a cold stare. "Isn't it, Ken?" I shot back, not bothering to lower my voice. "Seems to me this is the perfect place. After all, this is where you both thought you could get away with it, isn't it? Right here, in front of everyone." Ken's mouth opened, then closed again. He didn't have a response, and the crowd wasn't on his side. People started backing away, their murmurs growing louder, the judgment hanging thick in the air. And then Janice snapped. She stepped forward, her face twisted with fury. "How dare you?" she hissed at me, her voice shaking. "How dare you humiliate me like this?" I almost laughed at the absurdity of her words. "Humiliate you?" I repeated, incredulous. "You've been cheating on me for months. And I'm the one humiliating you?" My voice grew louder, sharper, cutting through the noise of the festival. "I worked my ass off to give you everything, and this is how you repay me." Janice didn't answer. She couldn't. Her fists clenched at her sides, her chest rising and falling with anger, but she had no defense. There was nothing she could say that would make this right. I could see the realization dawning on her face. She wasn't the victim here. Not anymore. Ken, on the other hand, looked like he wanted to crawl into a hole and disappear. He didn't have the guts to stand up for her, not in front of everyone. His perfect image had just been shattered, and there was no coming back from this. I could see it in the way he avoided looking at me, the way his shoulders slumped in defeat. He wasn't the charming, confident man Janice had fallen for. He was just a coward, exposed for what he really was. I took a step back, letting the moment sink in. The damage was done. The crowd had seen enough. And I didn't need to say anything more. The whispers had turned into full-blown gossip now, spreading like wildfire through the festival. Janice and Ken stood frozen in the middle of it all, their reputations in tatters. Without another word, I turned and walked away, leaving them to deal with the aftermath. I didn't need to stick around to watch the fallout. I had seen enough. They were ruined, and I wasn't going to waste another minute of my life on either of them. But as I left, I felt the weight of what I had done settle in my chest. Exposing them had brought a brief moment of satisfaction, but it hadn't erased the hurt. The betrayal still cut deep, and the anger still simmered just beneath the surface. This was far from over. After the festival, the town was buzzing with the fallout from my revelation. People whispered behind closed doors, casting glances my way when they thought I wasn't looking. Some pitied me, others just relished in the drama. It was a small town, after all, and nothing stayed quiet for long. But none of that mattered to me. I didn't care what people thought. I only cared about what came next. Janice hadn't come home that night. I wasn't surprised. After what had happened, she probably couldn't face me, couldn't look me in the eye knowing I had ripped her double life apart in front of everyone. The kids were asleep when I got back, blissfully unaware of the storm raging in their parents' world. I sat alone in the dark kitchen, the silence pressing in on me. As much as I wanted to believe that this was the end, I knew better. Exposing the affair was just the first step. Now came the hard part, deciding what to do with the rest of my life. I couldn't go on like this, living under the same roof as the woman who had betrayed me. The idea of pretending everything was normal, of keeping up the act for the sake of appearances, made me sick. The next morning, I decided to make my move. I couldn't let her think she still had control over the situation, that she could waltz back into our home and pretend nothing had happened. I had to take the power back, to show her that I was done playing the fool. I called a lawyer. The conversation was brief but necessary. I needed to know my options, to figure out how to protect myself and the kids. Divorce wasn't a word I ever thought I'd be saying, but here I was, standing on the edge of a life I hadn't chosen. The lawyer was straightforward, explaining the steps I'd need to take, the paperwork that would need to be filed. It all felt surreal, like I was standing outside of my own life, watching it crumble from a distance. When Janice finally came home later that afternoon, I was ready for her. She walked through the door with a mixture of defiance and guilt on her face, like she couldn't decide whether to be angry or apologetic. I didn't give her the chance to speak. "I've spoken to a lawyer," I said flatly, cutting her off before she could even open her mouth. "We're done." Her eyes widened, and for a brief moment, I saw a flash of panic cross her face. "Bill, wait. There's nothing to talk about, Janice," I interrupted, my voice cold. "You made your choice. You chose him." She opened her mouth to argue, but the words died on her lips. She knew I was right. There was no point in trying to explain, no point in making excuses. We stood there in silence for what felt like an eternity, the weight of everything we had built together hanging between us like a noose. "I'm taking the kids," I said finally, breaking the silence. "You can have the house." "I don't want it." Janice's eyes filled with tears, but I didn't feel sorry for her. This was the bed she had made, and now she would have to lie in it. I turned away from her, heading upstairs to pack a bag. I wasn't going to spend another night in that house, not with her. As I packed, I thought about the future, about what life would be like after this. It wasn't what I had planned, but maybe, just maybe, it was a chance for a fresh start. I had spent so long trying to hold on to something that was already broken. And now it was time to let go. Janice didn't try to stop me when I left. She just stood there, silent, watching as I walked out the door. And for the first time in months, I felt like I was in control again. Leaving the house felt like stepping into a different world. The air was heavy with the weight of my decision, but there was a strange sense of clarity in it, too. As I drove away, I kept my eyes on the road, but my mind was racing. What had once been familiar now felt foreign. The life I'd built with Janice had crumbled to dust. And in its place was a hollow sense of uncertainty. I hadn't told the kids yet. They were too young to understand the full extent of what was happening, and I wasn't ready to explain it all to them. But I knew that soon, I'd have to sit them down and tell them the truth. The thought of it made my chest tighten. How could I tell them that their mother had betrayed us, that our family was broken beyond repair? I didn't want them to feel the pain I felt, but there was no escaping it. They would have to know. I drove to my brother's place, a small cabin on the outskirts of town. He wasn't home, but he had given me a spare key long ago, knowing that I might need it one day. I let myself in and collapsed onto the worn-out couch, staring up at the ceiling. The silence in the cabin was deafening. There was no noise from the kids playing upstairs, no sound of Janice bustling around in the kitchen. It was just me, alone with my thoughts. I stayed there for hours, trying to make sense of everything. I thought about the years I had spent working to build a life for my family, the sacrifices I had made, the long hours on the farm. And for what? To be betrayed, lied to, and cast aside like I was nothing? The anger I had felt earlier was starting to rise again, bubbling up from deep inside. I clenched my fists, the muscles in my jaw tightening as I replayed the events of the past few months in my mind. But then I remembered the kids. I couldn't afford to lose control now, not with them depending on me. I had to stay focused, had to figure out a way forward. This wasn't just about me anymore, it was about them. They deserved better than the chaos I had left behind, and I had to make sure they got it. I pulled out my phone and called the lawyer again. We talked for a while, going over the details of the divorce, the custody arrangements, and the division of assets. It all felt so cold, so clinical, but it was necessary. I needed to protect the kids, and I needed to make sure Janice couldn't take advantage of the situation. She had already taken enough from me. After I hung up, I sat there in the dark, staring at the phone in my hand. This was my new reality: divorce papers, custody battles, and starting over from scratch. It wasn't what I had planned, but it was the only way forward. There was no going back now. The next day, I went to pick up the kids. Janice didn't say a word when I arrived. She just stood in the doorway, her face pale and drawn. The kids ran to me, excited to see me, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing around them. I hugged them tight, forcing a smile as I tried to push the bitterness away. For their sake, I had to pretend that everything was okay, at least for now. As we drove away from the house, I glanced at them in the rearview mirror. They were laughing, talking about school and their friends, completely oblivious to the fact that their world was about to change. I swallowed the lump in my throat, trying to focus on the road ahead. "Daddy, where are we going?" my youngest asked, her big blue eyes full of curiosity. "To Uncle David's for a little while," I said, keeping my voice steady. "We're going to have a fun time there, okay?" She nodded, satisfied with my answer, and went back to talking to her brother. But I knew the questions would come soon. They wouldn't stay in the dark forever. And when they did, I'd have to be ready. The days following my departure from the house were some of the hardest I had ever experienced. The kids sensed that something wasn't right, even though I tried my best to keep things normal for them. It wasn't long before they started asking questions. Why we were staying at Uncle David's, why Mommy wasn't with us. I tried to give them simple answers, ones they could understand without diving into the painful truth. But the truth had a way of catching up with us. One evening, after I had tucked them into bed, my oldest son came into the living room, his face serious. "Dad, are you and Mom getting divorced?" I froze. I had been preparing for this conversation, but hearing the words out loud still hit me like a punch to the gut. I motioned for him to sit down next to me on the couch. He was only 10, but in that moment, he seemed so much older, like he had already figured out more than I had wanted him to. "Yeah, Bud," I said quietly. "We are." He didn't say anything for a moment. He just stared at his hands, his brow furrowed in thought. "Is it because of something we did?" That question nearly broke me. I put a hand on his shoulder, pulling him into a hug. No, it's not because of you. None of this is your fault. Sometimes, grown-ups have problems that are hard to fix, and it has nothing to do with you or your sister. He nodded, but I could tell he was still trying to process it. "Are we still gonna be a family?" I swallowed hard, trying to keep my emotions in check. "We're always going to be a family, buddy. It'll just be a little different now." He didn't ask any more questions after that. He just sat there with me for a while, leaning his head on my shoulder. I wanted to tell him everything would be okay. That we would get through this without too much pain. But I couldn't lie to him. I knew this was going to hurt, for all of us. The next few days were a blur of paperwork and meetings with the lawyer. I had to sort out the logistics of the divorce, figure out custody arrangements, and start thinking about the future. It was exhausting, both mentally and emotionally, but I had no choice but to keep going. The kids needed me to be strong, and I couldn't let them down. Janice and I barely spoke during this time. When we did, it was only about the kids or the divorce proceedings. The anger between us had simmered down, replaced by a cold, distant silence. She knew she had lost, and I didn't have the energy to engage in any more arguments. We were done, and that was all there was to it. One afternoon, I sat down with the kids again to talk about what would happen next. I explained that they would be living with me most of the time, but that they would still see their mom regularly. I tried to make it sound like it wasn't a big deal. Like it was just a new chapter in our lives. But I could see the confusion and hurt in their eyes, and it killed me. As the days went by, I started to settle into a new routine. I focused on the farm, throwing myself into the work to keep my mind off the pain. The kids started adjusting, too. They missed their mom, of course, but they seemed to accept the new normal. We had our ups and downs, but for the most part, we were making it work. In the quiet moments, though, when the kids were asleep and the house was still, I would feel the weight of everything pressing down on me. The betrayal, the loss, the uncertainty of the future, it all came crashing down in those dark hours. But I knew I had to keep going. For the kids, and for myself. This was the first step forward, and I wasn't going to stop now. With the divorce process underway, the next phase of my plan started to take shape. My anger toward Ken hadn't faded, it had only sharpened, becoming a cold, calculated determination. I wasn't content with simply walking away from this mess. Ken needed to understand the consequences of his actions, and I was going to make sure of that. The farm kept me busy, but every spare moment I had, I was putting together my strategy. I knew that Ken prided himself on his car, a flashy new model he constantly flaunted at work and around town. It was his trophy, just like how he saw Janice. I knew that getting to him through his car would send a message loud and clear, and I had all the right connections to pull it off. My old friend, Mark, who worked at a local repair shop, owed me a few favors. We'd grown up together, and though we didn't see each other as much anymore, he still respected the years of work we'd shared on the farm. I reached out to him, careful to keep the conversation casual, making sure not to raise any suspicion about my real intentions. Mark didn't need to know everything, just enough to get the job done. We met at a local bar one evening after work, the clinking of beer bottles and low murmur of conversations creating the perfect cover for what I had in mind. After a few drinks, I laid out the basics. Ken had crossed a line, and I needed Mark's help to hit him where it hurt. I knew Mark wouldn't ask too many questions, and just like I expected, he agreed without hesitation. "Leave it to me," Mark said, taking a long pull from his beer. "I've got just the trick to make sure his car is out of commission for good." I nodded, feeling a sense of satisfaction settle over me. This was the first part of my revenge. It wasn't enough to destroy Ken's car, though. I wanted him to know why it happened, to feel the same sense of helplessness and betrayal I had felt when I discovered what he had done with Janice. But I'd have to be patient. I couldn't rush this. For the next few days, I went about my routine as if nothing had changed. I took care of the kids, worked on the farm, and kept my head down. But underneath the surface, I was waiting for the right moment. Mark had given me a timeline. Within the week, Ken's car would have an accident that would leave it beyond repair. In the meantime, I had other preparations to make. I needed to make sure that when the time came, Ken would know exactly who was responsible. And Janice? She wouldn't be able to protect him or explain it away. This wasn't just about Ken. This was about her, too. About what she had thrown away for a cheap thrill. They both needed to pay. The more I thought about it, the more it fueled my resolve. I wasn't just getting even. I was setting things right, reclaiming the respect and dignity they had stripped from me. And the moment of reckoning was drawing near. The morning came like any other, but I knew today would be different. Mark had called the night before to let me know everything was ready. Ken's car was sitting in the shop, awaiting a routine checkup, but it would leave in worse shape than when it arrived. Mark had done his work carefully, ensuring that the engine would fail beyond repair just a few miles down the road. Ken would never see it coming. I felt a strange calm as I went about my day, as if the weight of the past months was finally starting to lift. For once, I had control over my life, over my situation, over the outcome of this entire mess. I wasn't the victim anymore. I was the one calling the shots, and Ken would soon realize that. Late in the afternoon, I got a message from Mark. The car had been picked up, and everything had gone according to plan. It was only a matter of time before Ken's beloved vehicle broke down, stranding him in the middle of nowhere. I couldn't help but smile as I imagined the look on his face when he realized what had happened. But the real beauty of the plan lay in what would come next. I had left a little surprise for Ken, a note that Mark had slipped under the driver's seat. It was simple, just a few words written in black ink: "This is only the beginning." Ken wouldn't be able to ignore that. He would know it was personal, and he would start to feel the same anxiety, the same uncertainty that had plagued me for months. He'd wonder who was behind it, and eventually, he'd connect the dots. I wanted him to feel vulnerable. To realize that his actions had consequences. And when he did, I would be waiting. That evening, I took the kids out to dinner, making sure to keep everything as normal as possible for them. I didn't want them to feel the tension that was bubbling beneath the surface. They deserved better than that, and I was determined to shield them from the ugliness of what was happening between Janice, Ken, and me. As we sat at the restaurant, laughing and talking about their day at school, my phone buzzed with a message from Janice. I glanced at it, already knowing what it would say. "Ken's car broke down. He's stranded on the highway, and I'm going to pick him up. Can you watch the kids tonight?" I smirked, typing a quick response, of course. Take your time. I put my phone away, leaning back in my seat as the kids continued their conversation. They had no idea what was going on, and that was exactly how I wanted it. Tonight, Janice and Ken would have a lot to talk about. And this was just the first strike. The trap had been set. And now it had sprung shut. The days following the car incident were tense. I didn't hear from Janice, which was fine by me. She had enough on her plate dealing with Ken and his frustrations. I imagined him ranting about the unfairness of it all, cursing his bad luck, and trying to figure out who was behind the sabotage. But I knew he wasn't stupid. He would figure it out soon enough. It wasn't until a few days later that I got the call. I was working on the farm, the sun high in the sky. When my phone buzzed in my pocket, I pulled it out, recognizing Ken's number. I had saved it back when things were still amicable between us, back before everything had gone to hell. For a moment, I debated letting it go to voicemail. But no, this was what I had been waiting for. I answered, keeping my voice calm and neutral. Bill, Ken's voice came through, strained and tense. We need to talk. I didn't say anything right away, letting the silence stretch for just a moment too long. I don't see what there is to talk about, Ken. You know damn well what I'm talking about, he snapped. My car. That wasn't an accident, and we both know it. I leaned against the fence, wiping the sweat from my brow. What do you want from me, Ken? I want this to stop, he said, his voice dropping to a lower, more desperate tone. Whatever it is you're doing, it's got to stop. I don't know what you think you're going to accomplish, but I'm not doing anything, Ken, I interrupted. My tone cold and even. But maybe you should start thinking about why this is happening. You brought this on yourself. There was a pause on the other end, and I could almost hear him grinding his teeth. Bill, look, I know things between you and Janice are complicated, but this isn't the way to handle it. We can work something out. I'm willing to. I'm not interested in working anything out with you, Ken, I cut him off again. You made your bed, now lie in it. I hung up before he could say another word. A sense of satisfaction settling over me. This was far from over, but I had made my point. Ken was rattled, and that was exactly where I wanted him. Now it was time to escalate. The weeks that followed Ken's frantic call were like the calm before a storm. I'd rattled him, no doubt about that. He was on edge, looking over his shoulder, wondering when the next strike would come. I didn't rush. This was a game of patience, and I had all the time in the world to make him sweat. Janice, on the other hand, stayed quiet. I wondered if Ken had told her about our conversation, about his suspicions. But either way, she'd soon have to face the consequences of her choices too. I continued with my daily life as if nothing had changed. The farm was thriving, and the kids were doing well in school. They were my anchor through all of this, keeping me grounded when the weight of what I was doing threatened to pull me under. But every time I saw them, it reinforced my conviction. They deserved a father who wouldn't let himself be humiliated, who fought for his dignity. And that was exactly what I was doing. Ken's car was the first step. It had been a wake-up call, a reminder that he couldn't mess with my life and walk away unscathed. But now, it was time to hit him where it hurt even more, his reputation. Ken wasn't just some random guy. He was respected at work, the kind of man who wore his success like a badge of honor. People looked up to him, trusted him. That was the angle I'd exploit next. Through a few old contacts in town, I gathered some information. Nothing illegal, just a few whispers here and there. Ken wasn't as squeaky clean as he liked to pretend. A few bad deals, a couple of questionable business practices, things that would damage his reputation if they came to light. It wasn't enough to destroy him outright, but it would be enough to make people start questioning his integrity. I gathered all the information I could, careful not to leave any traces that could lead back to me. Then, one evening, I made a few anonymous calls. The local paper was always looking for a juicy story, and the tip I gave them was more than enough to get their attention. I didn't need to fabricate anything. Ken's dirty laundry would be aired for everyone to see, and the fallout would be inevitable. I sat back and waited, knowing it wouldn't take long for the news to break. Ken would be blindsided, and there would be no way for him to cover it up. His name would be dragged through the mud, and he'd have no one to blame but himself. A few days later, the story hit the headlines. It wasn't front-page news, but it was enough to make waves. I could already imagine Ken's reaction, the panic, the frantic calls to his lawyer or PR team. But none of that would stop the damage that had been done. His reputation was tarnished, and there was nothing he could do about it. I didn't feel guilty. If anything, it felt like justice. He had taken something from me. My family, my marriage. My pride. This was me taking something back, and it was only the beginning. The fallout from the article was swift. Ken's company launched an internal investigation, and word spread through town faster than I expected. People who once spoke highly of him now gave him a second glance, wondering what kind of man he really was. That's the thing about reputations. They're fragile, and once cracks start to show, they can shatter completely. I stayed out of it, of course, watching from the sidelines as Ken's world slowly unraveled. But it wasn't enough. Not yet. Janice had stayed quiet through all of this, and that silence was starting to gnaw at me. I had kept my distance from her, too angry to face her directly, but I knew that had to change. If I was going to end this chapter of my life, I needed closure. Not just with Ken, but with her. It was late one evening when I finally decided to confront her. The kids were asleep, and the house was quiet. I found her in the kitchen, sitting at the table with a glass of wine in front of her. She looked up when I entered, her eyes tired, but she didn't say a word. "Why didn't you leave?" I asked, breaking the silence. "After everything, after the affair. Why didn't you go with him?" She stared at me for a moment, as if weighing her words. "I thought about it," she admitted. "But I couldn't. I didn't want to leave the kids. And part of me didn't want to leave you." I scoffed, crossing my arms. Funny way of showing it. She looked down, her fingers tracing the rim of her glass. "I made a mistake, Bill. A terrible mistake. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I didn't want to destroy our family. I was lost." I felt a flicker of anger, but it wasn't as intense as before. Maybe it was because I had already done what I needed to do. I had hurt Ken, exposed him for the liar he was, and now I was here, standing face to face with Janice, and I realized that I didn't hate her anymore. I was angry, yes, but the burning hatred I had felt before was gone. What was left was something more like sadness. "You threw everything away for him," I said quietly. "For a man who doesn't care about you, who never will." "I know," she whispered. "And I'll have to live with that." I stared at her for a long time, wondering what would come next. Could we ever be a family again? Could I ever look at her the way I used to? The answer was no. Too much had happened, too much had been broken. But that didn't mean I couldn't find some kind of peace in all of this. "I'm not coming back, Janice," I said finally. Whatever we had, it's over. But I'll always be there for the kids. That's not going to change." She nodded, tears filling her eyes, but she didn't try to argue. She knew it was over, too. I left the kitchen and walked outside, taking a deep breath of the cool night air. For the first time in months, I felt a sense of calm settle over me. The revenge, the anger, the need to make things right, it had all led to this moment, and now, it was done. Ken would never recover fully from what I had done to him. His career, his reputation, and even his relationship with Janice were in ruins. But I didn't care anymore. I had gotten what I needed, closure. And now, it was time to move on.